So before I start, I would want to make a few caveats with my presentation. It's talking about transparency. At least in the line of our work, we've had some problems when we talk about transparency. The question is always, what is your standard of transparency? In some places, transparency is it looks like it's a forbidden word. Once you mention it, it looks like you are accusing fisheries management of some wrongdoing. All the same, we'll have to discuss it. And it's good that most of you here are persons who are involved in enforcement of fisheries laws in the various countries and with relevant interests in the area. I remember when we had a project and then we went to about 4 countries. So in one of the places, one of the Francophone countries, the question, when we mentioned transparency, because we had to interact with fisheries managers. And then the question was, when we said transparency, the access, transparency, c'est quoi? C'est quoi? C'est quoi? Even in Ghana, when we went to one of the offices, they asked us, what is our rationalization of transparency, right? Meaning that there could be varied understandings of the concept of transparency. But all the same, I don't think my presentation is not going to go into detail as to what is transparency. Right. So this is a brief of the outline. We're looking at what transparency in fisheries mean. That's the emphasis. Look at the West African context, then transshipment in perspective, the legal and regulatory challenges, the impact, and then we'll look at some case studies, and then I will conclude. Like I said, what is transparency? I would say it's a chameleon-hued word, because it takes of the circumstances of anything. What is it about transparency that we should even be discussing? Right. In the ordinary meaning of what transparency is, we say that it is the ability to see through something. Let's see how something is done. What are the decisions that inform the doing of that thing? It would sometimes connote some ethical standard. But in the context of fisheries, transparency does not necessarily mean that somebody is not doing something well, that there's some unethical behavior. But it is about the decision-making process. It is about the accessibility or the availability of fisheries information. Now, in that regard, who is fishing? What is the person fishing? Where is the person fishing? What is the information? We are talking about fines. If we are talking about fines, how much fines have you gotten? Who did we get the fines from? Now, all that is supposed to enable and to inform fisheries management. If the citizens or the public would have to participate in decision making, they would have to participate from an informed position. So fisheries transparency enables the citizens, the public, to participate in decision making in the fisheries. And that's why the emphasis on accessibility and availability of fisheries information. So the goal is to improve fisheries governance and management. Now, why is it then an issue for transshipment? Why is transparency an issue for transshipment? All right. We know that transshipment is landing or taking fish, landing fish from landing fish at places that you didn't catch it. So from one place to the other. Now, once the fish is caught elsewhere and landed elsewhere or transferred, what means is that there's likely not going to be any data as to who caught the fish, what fish was caught, how was it caught, what gear was used. All that information is obfuscated. We do not know. We do not know. Now, transshipment could be associated with so many other problems. It may just be an issue of just transshipment, or it may be associated or come with other problems. These other problems could be in terms of either a limited monitoring capacity of the states, or it could be an issue of illegality in itself. We've spoken sometimes about fish piracy. It could be an issue of fish piracy. It may not be the issue of fish piracy or crime in itself, but it may be an issue of just trying to obscure the origins of fish in terms of traceability and all that. All right. So, wanting to know when ship will be transshipped, where it is going to, and who is doing it is an issue of transparency. There have been a number of initiatives to enforce or to enforce transparencies in the fisheries. So one of them is the FITI standard, and then they have about 12 standards for fisheries transparency. Now, all that these standards do is that let's have the information. Let the information be publicly accessible. So if you would have to transship, what are the decisions that will authorize the transshipment of fish? Now, the FITI standards would include having that information publicly available. Let's know beforehand when somebody takes the decision to authorize it, if it is permitted, what would be the basis of that information? How do we verify it? There's also the Global Charter for Fisheries Transparency, championed by the Coalition for Fisheries Transparency, and then they have Principle 6, specifically talking about transparency in the fisheries. And they are saying that that there should be a ban on transferring fish between boats at sea unless it is pre-authorized and carefully monitored and publicly logged. Now, within the West African context, you will find that there's so much information and context why transshipment becomes a problem. I believe that earlier presentations would have already given the context, right? And that will include that our region, within the region, it is highly prone to IUU activity. So the estimate is that about 37% of the region's catch is from IUU. Most of this data were taken some time. As to whether it is still the same, I won't be able to say that, but that is the estimation so far. And if you extrapolate that, it may look like it's still the case. Now, and it results in the loss of $2.3 billion over the period, annual losses. Now, beyond that, you would find that the fishery in the region is also a bit unique in itself. So unlike other places that you just have the industrial fisheries, here we have at least, in most of the countries, we would have at least 3 types of fishery. You have the artisanal, then you have those in between, then you have the industrial. Okay. Now, beyond that, there's also the issue of the consumption, the per capita consumption. We eat a lot of fish within the West Africa region. It is not only just, it is an issue of nutrition and food security. I believe that most of you, if you took your breakfast, you would have eaten some fish this morning. It is the same thing. To cook without fish is almost unthinkable in the region. All right. This is a graph of some work that was done. It may look a bit old, but it still tells the story of the IUU situation within the region. All right. It's approaching about almost 10 years now, but we believe that it still tells the story of IUU within our region. Now, transshipment in perspective. I've already indicated that fish transshipment is a transfer of fish from one vessel to another, right? From one vessel to another. Now, in the case of West Africa, it normally happens between bigger boats, the larger vessels, and then smaller ones. But the FCWC identifies even more types, and then it's not necessarily smaller boats. With the smaller boats, the name evolved for it. We call it cycle. I don't know if the cell is the same in other places, but in my search, it's the same name that seems to be cutting across the region, right? Now, it would happen in so many forms, or it manifests itself in so many forms, right? But there is transfer of fish from one vessel to the other. It is not landed before it is transferred, right? It's not landed. And once that is done, it creates blind spots for MCS. if you transfer at high seas, the ability of the state to monitor what is being transferred is next to zero. A lot of the countries within the region don't have the capacity to police most of it. So to transfer would create blind spots for MCS. The diagram here is trying to depict the IU or transshipment hotspots. So you find that it's all along our region. So this should be the EEZ, and then you have all these spots just within our region. What are the drivers? What are the motivators? Why will vessels want to transship? Or why will the locals want to transship? So many factors and motivations. For the local or the artisanal fishery, it's lucrative. If you can simply go to sea and then come back with a catch without casting a net, without spending so much in fuel, you will definitely do it. You won't have to mend your nets, which is an operational issue. Your expedition is cut, the cost of expedition is cut. For the industrial vessels, it means that less trips to the port to land the catch. So a vessel comes and then you can continuously fish, and then another vessel comes and then takes the fish wherever it has to go. It means that you can stay at sea longer, so you can maximize your operational time to also maximize the long-term gains. If it is a symptom of some other issue, say crime, then what it means is that you'll be able to sell, to fund other things. There's sometimes the linkage between IU, transshipment, and piracy. Now, if it is, or some other crimes, if the purpose of the transshipment is to transfer to that vessel in order to get the resources for some other illegal activity, then it becomes lucrative. It becomes a means to fund that illegality, right? Issues about licensing. Licensing is a problem within the region. A problem in the sense that along the region, it is required that in order to get a license to fish, you must be either a national, it must be a Ghanaian vessel, Sierra Leonean vessel, or any of the national vessels, or owned by people. Now, if you cannot get a vessel because you cannot get a license because you are not a national or it's not owned by nationals, one of the ways to do that would be to get a to engage in transshipment. So the vessel, the taken vessel would not necessarily need to be a licensed vessel in any of the coastal states. How then does it happen in practice, connecting it to IEU? We've indicated that, right, it's a means to launder the fish piracy. The identity of it is also sometimes not known. The operations, how it is caught, becomes also a problem. And then there's extended time at sea. Extended time at sea would also have its own implications. In most of the regions, there's a minimum number of days that you must spend at sea. In Ghana, I think it's about 30 days or even less. So you cannot be at sea longer than that. Now, once you engage in transshipment, what it means is that you would extend your time at sea will be extended. Now, when you spend more time at sea, there's also going to be pressures on your crew, right? So if they are not necessarily your nationality, you'll likely be abusing them, and we'll talk about that as one of the impacts later. Where are the hotspots? Now, from Global Fishing Watch data, what it tells us is that in Angola, you would have about 3.4 events per week. In Ghana, it is 2.8 events per week, all right, more than neighboring Cote d'Ivoire. And Guinea-Bissau is 2.1 events per week. Mauritania likewise. Yet in all these countries, there is either a ban or a limitation or some restriction on transshipment. So you would find from this table, which is from work done by EGF, it indicates that at least 2 countries along the region have bans at transshipment at sea, and then the rest they authorize. They have there's authorization to transship. The national rules. When you look at most of the national rules in Cote d'Ivoire, yes, it prohibits it except with authorization. In Senegal, transshipment is also it's authorized only in exceptional cases, and the conditions are supposed to be set in the regulations. In Liberia, transshipment at sea is permitted subject to certain conditions, and these conditions will include that you must continuously transmit your AIS position during the transshipment period. In Gambia, you cannot transship without the prior approval of the director, and then as a condition of the license or the issuance of the license, transshipment restrictions are part. Likewise, you have the same thing in Sierra Leone, where it requires at least, in order to transship, you must apply for it, or you must apply for authorization 72 hours before the event. Guinea-Bissau, same thing. And then Ghana, which is which only made our law, I think that's last week, the new law. It says that transshipment without authorization is prohibited, but at sea transshipment it's also prohibited. What are the legal and regulatory challenges? So from the regional context, you'll find that different regulations across countries. Some authorize it, others prohibit it. Now, if you authorize it, what are the conditions for the authorizations? That is where sometimes the problem comes from. Transshipment is both a problem for both the coastal state as well as the flag state. So if you only license the vessel but the vessel doesn't land the fish, it becomes a problem, right? There are varying levels of enforcement along the region, so MCS varies. The level of MCS efficacy varies. Issues about collaboration, although SCWC is not trying to work something on that. Then the issues about observers. Now, in countries that allow transshipment and it has to be supervised, what they require or what they normally do is that they rely heavily on the observer, the fisheries observer. There are problems with using the fisheries observer. Apart from compromising fisheries observers, even their safety is an issue. So the question is, why then do you authorize something that you cannot effectively regulate? There's the problem of overreaching beneficial ownership laws. The regulations in almost all countries require national ownership, yet when you go, the vessels within the sub-region are ultimately not owned by nationals. There's also the ineffective international regulation within the international spectrum, right? The FAO voluntary guidance are not binding. Our regulations are specific. Vary implementation of port state measures agreement. Then there's also the problem of flags of convenience. And then UNCLOS itself only gives the basic framework. The basic framework so that states will then provide a specific regulation, but that's all. What are the impacts? The impacts vary from economic impacts in terms of employment, reduction in employment, to port fees. It means that if the vessel will not land the fish at the port, that will mean that there will be losses in port fees. There will be reduced addition value. The issue of who would add value to the fish before it's exported, that is lost. If transshipment continues, there's always a motivation to catch more. So obviously, it will lead to depletion of the resource. Already, that is an issue along the region. There's a social aspect, food security. I've indicated that we eat a lot of fish, so fish is a food security issue, and in some cases, it may be a national issue, a national security issue. So what it means is that if the fish is not landed and then it's taken elsewhere, local communities will not have the food that they need. It's a source of animal protein, 60%. Livelihoods of coastal states, coastal communities will also be impacted. Then there's the issue about human rights. I try to explain that with extended time at sea, the crew will be forced to work longer, all right? And that could be a problem. There's environmental aspects as well that will be linked to the resource, the exploitation of the resource. We don't know how the fish is caught, what was used to catch the fish, and it continues. And then that would cascade into biodiversity loss and the related issues. Right. Now, there have been a few recorded issues of transshipment. I think in Dr. Ife's presentation, she mentioned a few that happened in 2022, but these are others that EGF tried to investigate and then were able to document. So we have this, Sarah Loba. This happened in 2012. So from the fish was from Guinea. It was landed in Korea. The fish was landed in Korea. Then you have the vessel Seta 73. This happened in 2011. Right. From Guinea and Sierra Leone, then into Spain. Now there are others as well. Mabrampat 803, which was also illegal fishing in Sierra Leone, then transshipped to another vessel. Then Lianran 32, similar issues. At least within our local setting, Ghana, it's mostly known as psycho, right? And then, but these days, I think we found a way to resolve it. In fact, the argument has always been whether there's still psycho or whether there's still transshipment in Ghana or not, whether it has taken another form. That is it. Right. How then do we improve transparency at sea for transshipment? Our thought is that there's a need for improved MCS capability and capacity. The region is lacking in the ability to police the sea. So enhancing the capability of MCS would greatly improve transparency. Now, it's not just the capacity, but as well as their capability. I don't know how many fisheries regulators along the region have the ability to go beyond the territorial sea, or even have the ability to even go at sea to inspect. They mostly rely on observers. Observers have their challenges. Enhancing transparency and accountability in national fisheries management. So we have indicated that if it is going to be authorized, under what circumstances will it be authorized? In most of the countries where transshipment is permissible, subject to authorization, we need to know beforehand what would require the authorization to be given. Now, sometimes that is not known, so that it will depend on a case-by-case basis, but that is not good fisheries management. Let's know beforehand what are the circumstances to authorize transshipment. Then there's the need to adopt clear and consistent guidelines for transshipment along the region. I think the FAO has recently drafted some guidelines, but it is still not law. It is still voluntary to regulate transshipment. Then there's the need for regional and international cooperation to combat transshipment. The problem of transshipment is a problem for both coastal and flag state, right? Although the burden is sometimes unproportionally on the coastal state rather than the flag state, right? So I just have a few references that you may be interested in to look at. But beyond that, thank you very much.